All right, well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to NYU for hosting this La Pietra dialogue that we have. That's a branch off of the Parties Conference that we're hosting up at Villa Balze, Georgetown's campus, so a little cross-campus discussion here. That conference, just to give a bit of context for the handful of people who are not up there, is about the relationship to how to understand political parties in the United States and how we might understand them outside the United States, and try to get scholars to think about those things. And that's obviously a really relevant question for sort of discussing current events, because a lot of what's going on in different countries, we think, oh, that's another example of this thing, but maybe it isn't. It would be good if people who really know what's going on could have a conversation about that. And so that's what I'd like to do. Let me briefly introduce the panel here, and then I'll turn things over to them to discuss. Starting immediately close to me is Antonella Sedone, who's a fellow at the University of Turin and works on inter-party democracy and also on populist parties and extremist groups. And she's the convener of the Candidate and Leader Selection Standing Group of the Italian Political Science Association. Next to her is Giulia Zari, who's from Marquette University, and she's worked on presidential rhetoric and the presidency and American political parties. She's the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of Presidential Mandate, and she blogs at 538 and at Mischiefs of Faction blog, hosted at vox.com. Next to her is Seth Maskett from the University of Denver and the director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He's the author of The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy, and of No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarize Legislatures. He's also the co-author of a forthcoming textbook that his co-author is doing a really lousy job of holding up his hand on. And he also blogs at Mischiefs of Faction and at Pacific Standard. And then finally on the end, we have Gianluca Passarelli, who is at Sapienza University. His latest book is on the presidentialization of political parties, and he does research on the presidents of the republic, political parties, electoral systems, and the like, and is the convener of the ECPR Standing Group on Presidential Politics. So this group is sort of well-equipped to help us answer this broad question about understanding politics in these two different domains. And in particular, I want to ask the question about whether or not populism, or something like populism, is a common phenomena here and in the United States and across other places. So it's easy to see similar elements to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders on the one hand, and to the Lega and Cinque Stelle here, and for that matter to parties and movements in UKIP and the like across Europe. And so the question I'd like to pose to all of you, and we can just move down the line, I think, is it reasonable to say that there's something common across all of that? Is there a common thing? And if so, then why now?
I think that, yes, populism is now a global phenomenon. And this is why, as you said, if you think about Northern League or Five Star Movement or Syriza or Podemos, so left-wing or right-wing parties, there are common traits. And the common traits can be found on the anti-elite blaming. That's the common thing among these different kind of parties. And yes, it is now, because basically that's my point of view, and I don't want to be very normative, but I think that the point is the crisis of political parties and their failure to act as agents of representation. Basically, what we can see is that, and this is also what we discussed this afternoon in the first section of this conference, political parties, well, they changed their organization. They are no more able to mobilize citizens, to socialize them. And this is a problem when the society has changed. I mean, higher education levels and a lot of a new form of sources of information. So citizens basically can be also, I don't know, independent from parties, but then parties basically withdraw from their grassroots And when there is the globalization, and the globalization fails, and there is the economic crisis, and you, as citizens, as a citizen, are suffering the effects of the economic crisis, and you see that the parties are not able to explain you how and why they are implementing some kind of policies that maybe are suggested or requested or, I don't know, requested by supranational elites that you cannot understand how they work, well, you are basically without coordinates. So you can be more sensitive to this kind of rhetoric against the elites. And anti-party feelings, I don't think that we can make a sort of equivalence between anti-party feelings and populism. But really, I think that anti-party feelings are a great component of populism. Populism develops where there is this failure of populist parties. When parties are able to create a sort of sanitary cordon, well, populist parties, they do not develop, and you could prevent to allow them to go to govern. But really, I don't want to be normative in this sense, but that's my feeling. How many minutes will
Okay,
okay, sorry.
So yes,
sorry.
I think we
Because-
have a good group and we can have a conversation, and,
Yeah,
and that sounds like a great start. So I'll leave it to Julia.
Great. So I've been trying to puzzle on this question of what populism is, and both in a global sense, which I don't know that much about, and in the American politics sense. I've been to several conferences where the topic was populism, and we've wasted like an entire afternoon session trying to define it and given up, and just sort of agreed to disagree. But the way I define populism is in terms of a kind of rhetoric of anti-elite appeals, and I think that can be mapped onto both left ideology and right ideology. And I think one of the questions in American politics that we've kind of dropped the ball on analytically is whether populism is a cause of intra-party strife, within party disagreement, or whether it's a result of it. And I think if you just were to look at 2016 in isolation, you would potentially assume that populist appeals are the cause of division within parties, that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in particular were the agents of these kinds of divisions within the two US parties. I think if you took a broader view, you would actually find that populism is sometimes a result of existing intra-party divisions, because it's a way for people within a party to make appeals that differentiates them from other candidates. And so I think that's the sort of my answer to your why now question, is the two parties in the US are very old, and we've been in what I would describe as the Reagan kind of system, set of questions, agreements, disagreements, relationships within the parties. We've been in that system for quite a while now, and so I see populist appeals as growing out of some of that stagnation. I realize that's a very political answer, and that there's also an economic answer that has to do with inequality and with lack of responsiveness. But I do think there's a good case for reversing the causality when we think about why populism has emerged when it has. So I'll hand it off.
I'd like to answer your question. I'm going to offer two anecdotes. The first is about 2 years ago, in May of 2016, I met an Italian couple from Milan who were basically laughing at me. They told me, we had a populist celebrity billionaire, and now you're going to get one too. And I said, no, we're not. We won't do that. Look at the polls. It's not going to happen. And of course, they were right. So, okay, there was a sense that something was going on. It was not unique to the United States. Another piece of evidence, I've been doing some interviews throughout different parts of the United States. Right now, there is a Democratic primary going on for the governor's race in South Carolina. Those of you not familiar with it, South Carolina is a deeply Republican part of the country. However, this is considered a fairly competitive year. The Democrats may have a shot at this governor's race. In the Democratic primary, there is one candidate running. His name is Jim Smith. He is widely perceived to be the establishment favorite. You know, basically all of his colleagues in the state legislature have been pushing him to run. All the labor organizations, all the Democratic voices in the area have just considered him their favorite candidate. His colleagues in the state legislature encouraged him and asked him to deliver the response to the State of the State address, a big annual address that the Republican governor delivers. And so this was a good chance for him to get his message out, to be on television. The state Democratic Party urged him not to do this. They urged him to decline this honor because, yes, he's the establishment favorite, but this would make him look like the establishment favorite. And that was seen as potentially dangerous to his candidacy. He did it anyway. I think he'll be okay. But I thought it was fairly telling about kind of the state of parties that they still have this situation where parties pick favorites, but now they're going out of their way to make it look like they're not picking favorites. They're sort of aware that anyone who looks popular right now could be taken down by this sort of populist movement that's going on. I do get the impression that even though there's always some sort of a constituency for these populist messages, and that all you have to do is say, I think the establishment is corrupt, and some people will join you, there's more of that going on right now. And I don't have a great sense of why now, as opposed to at other times. These things tend to go in waves, and I think we're kind of riding that wave at the moment.
Charles de Gaulle would say vast program. I mean, populism, what populism is, I'm not Casmade, so I will not deal with populism is, because I'm not an expert of populism, but I would divide the two arguments, because there is no an overlapping, so you may correct to keep them separately. The populism and the anti-party system. So I will focus a bit on one of them, and especially on Italy, on two cases, briefly. Does the anti-party sentiment represent a new political phenomenon in Italy and in Europe and in the world? I don't think so, first. So we as political scientists, at least us, we should not be so surprised as a young girl at the first rendezvous. Secondly, does this sentiment represent a danger for the democracy? I'm not answering, I'm just trying to add some arguments to this interesting debate. I think that the most dangerous part of this title is the anti-system party. We cannot consider parties as populist. Everybody is populist now. It's like Cinderella's shoe. Everybody is looking for it, but nobody can find it. So Trump is populist, Berlusconi is populist, Salvini is populist, Five-Star Movement is populist, Macron is populist. Mais Macron, il est populiste. Everybody knows. Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I'm sorry, but was a big populist. He was. So, and then what do we have? Nothing. We are not journalists. I'm sorry if there is any journalist here, but we are political scientists. We need something more measurable. We need some more grain concept. So, populism can be measured, but we cannot overlap with other concepts. So, for example, in the Italian case, you have the Five-Star Movement, which is clearly a populist party, but is not an anti-system party. It is a pro-system party. Vice versa, you have the Northern League, which is a populist party and is a extreme right, xenophobe, racist party, which is a not democratic party. which, if European Union would work well, should be considered as the Haider party in 1999 when they went to the government, and the Austria was almost banned from the diplomatic relationship. So I would consider those two elements differently, separately. So we have these general trends of populism. Okay, Northern Europe is right-wing populism, and Southern Europe is left-wing populism because Southern Europe is lazy and so forth. No, it's not that the answer. Philip Schmitter knows very well that is not the answer in Portugal. Why in Portugal we don't have extreme right party? So there is some more deeper answer, some more deeper reason. So, as you say, that is a free discussion. I will intervene once, so I will consider just 2 minutes more, if I may, Hans. So I think that, as Sartori would say, there is an overstretching of those concepts. We cannot consider populism as something that is there, but we cannot catch him because he's undefinable by himself. So we should be more careful. For example, again, in the Italian case, the Italian Communist Party in the 50s, in the 60s, was a pro-democratic party. It was not. Until 88 and the conference of the party, when people were asked which was the model they were looking at, was the party delegates, 80% answered USSR, and Cuba second. So it was with a very deeper feeling of anti-system and the populist too. But the party, somebody said that already, the party was able to keep in democratic borders those feelings. It's not because now people in Europe became anti-party citizens. It's because there were some organizations that were able to organize the voice, the criticism in a democratic path, following the democratic structures. So, again, for example, and I'm finishing here, the Radical Party in Italy was born in the 70s. It was a very legalistic, I would say, party, pro-system, but was against the elite. So, if this title is interesting, and I think it is interesting, we should focus on different aspects of it and on different countries. Grazie.
Can I respond to
Yeah,
that with my
please
single
do.
country case
Please
study?
do. Please do.
But so I've been trying, I actually started before Trump was elected, trying to measure rhetoric of sitting presidents, and I was using populism as my variable to see if presidents say the same thing when they travel to different places. And I picked populism just because it was a kind of appeal that I thought both Democrats and Republicans would use, and I didn't have any real substantive interest in populism, and then this all happened. So prior to all of that, so John Gehring has this book about parties and ideologies and historical context in the United States, and he agrees with you that Franklin Roosevelt was a populist, or was part of the populist era of the Democratic Party, and he also talks about right populism. So the categories that I used were a kind of rhetorical glorification of ordinary life, an anti-elite sentiment or blaming the elites for things, and then a kind of building on my previous work on mandates, a kind of idea of I'm doing this because I was elected to or because I'm the voice of the people. And I did some hand coding of that. I read about 200 speeches from George W. Bush from 2004. That was fun. I presented that at APSA in 2016, so that's papers on the internet somewhere. And Bush didn't use that much populist rhetoric. There wasn't a really clear geographical pattern. When he talked about populism, either he made these kind of folksy comments about the rich, or which was funny, but whatever. That was not the funniest American politics would get, right? Or he talked about being a C student and kind of glorifying the idea of being a C student. And those were the things. But otherwise, there wasn't much populist rhetoric from Bush. This situation, I've only scratched the surface of Trump's first 100 days and what he said on the road when he was traveling once he was in office. He uses a lot of populist rhetoric. And the thing that I think is interesting about Trump is where he fits in with the history of populism in the US, which is very geographical. So the populist movement in the US, 1890s, the upper Midwestern and Western part of the country, and those claims are very much rooted in a geographical set of claims about economic elites and agrarian interests. And then in the 60s, we get the George Wallace populism, so it's rooted in anti-elite claims that are also rooted in a kind of sense of Southern exceptionalism and being persecuted by elites. And so Trump comes in, and a lot of the stories around Trump combine those two narratives, that he uses his economic populism to win the upper Midwest, and he uses some of these George Wallace themes to win over other voters that we can talk about in the normative portion of the program. But what I actually found with what Trump actually said was most of his populist appeals were about the media and hating on the media, and most of them were to other Republican elites. They were not in his travels throughout other parts of the country. So he did go to Michigan, he did go to Wisconsin, but he didn't really emphasize these themes. Where he talked about the media most was at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Maryland to other conservatives who had traveled to Maryland for that purpose. So that's kind of the very short history of where Trump fits in with American populism, and maybe some definitions derived from the American politics literature that might be helpful.
Great, thanks. So one thread that's come up in this conversation here that I want to push on a little bit more to get some more reactions about is this distinction between what I've labeled in the title anti-party sentiment on the one hand and populism. Because I do think that they're slightly different. On the other hand, there's so much about the way that anti-party sentiment seems to play out that seems to be similar to populism. So let me just give an example. There's an op-ed in the Washington Post just this week from the Five-Star Movement saying we're an unstoppable force, and it's only 700 words long, and it's all just chalked through. I'm sure that if you analyzed it, you'd find a lot of populist type appeals. It's all about the elites that are a problem and how we have to try to get out from underneath them. But it's very high tech as well, right? In 700 words, there's a mention of 3 different software platforms, and how those things are going to liberate the people from the sort of establishment. And that's very different than I think most populism is, but still has an isomorphic quality. And so whether we categorize them as the same, we can create new words, but is there a way in which they either feed each other or reinforce each other or fight each other? You see where I'm seeing this connection, and what do you think of it? Anyone?
I mean, okay, I'll jump in on that. I mean, I think you're right. I see the connection that you're talking about. It's a similar sort of rhetoric used. At the same time, a lot of the anti-party movement, to the extent we have it, where some group proposes getting around the current partisan system or undermining the current party system, is one of the most elite movements I think we get, at least in the US. Mm-hmm. It's almost invariably some sort of, we will use the internet to save democracy and get rid of parties which we won't need anymore. Or we will use the internet to run parties and make nominations using some algorithm, which will be much more efficient than voting. Or, the latest version of it, we will go to Mars, and we will have some sort of new software platform there that will organize direct plebiscite elections for everything. We will no longer need parties or even elected officials. That's fairly elite. Now, is there, but it does use the same sort of rhetoric. I think you're absolutely right. But then at the same time, populist movements, as we've been talking about, Roosevelt, for example, these tend to be not very poor people who are using this sort of language. It is often not a way necessarily to have common people rise up, but it's sort of a way of people who are not currently empowered within the party system to get that power, and just get around what they see as the establishment, quote unquote, and the political establishment rather than the economic establishment.
I think that your provocative and stimulating argument should be analyzed. But I think personally that the two topics address two different dimensions. As I said, I still think that you can have, as for example in the Belgian case, of Vlaams Blok, of whatever the name was or is, you can have, because we have a lot of literature in that. There are many articles. You can have this, for example, anti-immigrants sentiment on one side that is coupled with high levels standard on civil rights, liberalism, because it is something different. You can have a difference on the policy. Is something that is very well established in the literature. You can have this a feeling, a position that is strong or populist on some policy, but it's different on your feeling, your sentiment in terms of democracy. So, or institutions. So I can be a very true democratic, not in the partisan meaning.
Small d.
No, big D. Big, like democracy. So big D. And I can be against some behavior of some religious groups, like a fanatic or something like that. So it is an argument. So, I don't know, maybe I don't have any empirical evidence on that. Maybe, I guess they can reinforce each other, but from a theoretical point of view, I will keep them separate.
Okay. What you just suggested made me think about a research which I was involved. It was a survey, a research design aimed to understand which are the driven factors of populist attitudes. And in particular, the idea was to understand how media may affect populist attitudes. So there was this, it was a comparative survey. There were, I think, 13 countries involved. It was part of a cost action project. So in Italy, we organized this survey, representative sample, etc., etc. Each group was received news, fake news, let's say, which was framed in different ways. So the idea was to blame politicians on the first group, blaming immigrants, blaming economic elites, blaming the wealth. And in the end, you can see that populist attitudes, it is just how you were saying, so you can have different feelings. So you could see that even if, I don't know, the frame was different, there was just one pattern. Relative deprivation was the thing affecting anti-elite blaming and anti-immigrants blaming. So even if you had, I don't know, a left-wing position, well, the thing that drives your populist attitudes, your support for populist ideas, was something related to your economic situation, your perception of economy. And I think that this is interesting. And I don't know, this also tells something about how, I don't know, media could frame populist contents and, I don't know, direct some kind of feelings. And what you were suggesting also about the new technologies, I think that should us think about the role of social media, for example, and how social media offer a real fertile ground for the development of populism. Just because in social media, populist leaders can interact directly with their supporters. And I think that this is crucial when we think about populism, because basically we are talking about anti-party feelings and anti-elite. But this was your first view. I mean, the core business of populism is the valorization of the people. So in social media, you have the direct interaction, which goes also on the idea of leadership and personalization and so on, but you are really interacting with the leader, and who cares if, I mean, there is a web manager dealing with the web page of the leader. You have the impression to be on the same level. So there is no elite. You are a common citizen able to interact. And I think that this is something that we have to think about, because we were talking also about the redefinition, reorganization of political parties, which are no more so organized, let's say, and they are trying to redefine themselves on other arenas. And social media are a new arena. I mean, the example of the Northern League in Italy, it's very interesting, because you can see that there is a party which is very organized on the north of the country, where he born and he developed, and in the end, recently, during the leadership of Salvini, he tried to develop outside his stronghold, and it used social media to develop. And I had a few interviews with some officers of the Northern League, and they expressed their concerns, because they said, okay, we are developing, we are going to get a great result, but we are not organized. If I go on the south of Italy, I'm not able to mobilize people. We are only relying on the power of our leader, which use this kind of arguments. So anti-elite, which maybe could not be the party, but the banks, the EU, the corporates, globalization, and so on, and the valorization of the people, homogeneous people. And one thing that I noticed, for example, also concerning the migrants issue, was that, okay, there is in, for example, the Northern League rhetoric, the blaming of migrants, but it's very, very often related to the economic side, not the values or cultural threat of immigrants. So I would suggest really to take in a serious account this economic issue.
And you think that the economic dimension is sort of lurking in the U.S. discussion in a weird way. And if we're going to talk about FDR, then I think we should talk about the relationship between party structure and anti-elite populist appeals and then left-wing economic policy, which in the U.S. case is often labeled populist in a way that I think is conceptually unhelpful. So one of the things that I think is notable about the U.S. case is we have a very long-standing strain of anti-partyism that isn't always about populism. So if you go back to the Whig Party, that is not at all a populist party, but it was a party that had reservations about the concept of party politics. But with FDR, you get like some pieces of that anti-party strain too. His movement within his party was a way of pushing back against the boss power structure within the party and the fractures within the Democratic Party as well. So you had sort of a more conservative, agrarian, southern wing of the party, then you had the machine politics. And FDR kind of came in with a more platform-oriented way of being a party leader, and that platform-oriented way of being a party leader drew on notions of anti-economic elites and moving left on party politics. I think that's where we get the FDR populism. And I think we have a similar moment now of a combination of economic inequality, and people are very receptive to anti-economic elite appeals. We have fractured parties. What we don't have at the moment is a president who's a left-wing populist. We have a president who's a right-wing populist. I think right-wing populism has a shorter history in the US case, so I think we have less of a roadmap as to where that's going.
Great. So the next thing I wanted to ask about is something actually that Antonella brought up, and so I want to get a reaction from the rest of you, which is about social media and all of this. That, you know, there was a sense that Facebook and Twitter and, well, maybe especially something like Facebook was going to help make connections and help bridge and make it easier for us to talk to, and it almost seems like it's the opposite as a consequence. So what role does social media have to play in both of these concepts? If there's just two, maybe there's 3 or 4, but in these concepts that we're talking about, and I'll throw it out there. And what can we do about it if we think that something should be done?
I jump on the. In 2013, the share of voters, of five-star movement voters, who decide to support that movement at the time, who got their political information on TV were 80%, 80. So the role of social media, not only because I'm against everything that is political communication, you're taping so I can say to my colleagues that studies those arguments, is not only because of idiosyncrasy, personal idiosyncrasy, it's because then there is the reality. Otherwise, you cannot explain the success of parties in areas where internet does not work, but because behind this argument, there is TV, there is the role of a social media, which is TV. At that time, it was a radio, the time of our friend, but is TV, and so the so-called social networks or whatever. I don't think they have a big. I know there is. You have a problem with Cambridge, whatever.
No.
But
It's going great. It's going great.
I'm not good in diplomatic stuff. But I mean, of course, I'm exaggerating deliberately, but there is an importance. But don't think that everybody is following your tweet. Because, for example, in these days, not your, it was a you in general. In those days, there is a debate about the fact that is Italian politics. The Democratic Party with minus D should ally with the winner party, which is the five-star movement, which, by the way, is not the winner, but anyway. So the hashtag is senza di me, is without me. So if you do that, you the leadership, do it, but without me, not in my name, let's say. So then some important colleagues that study those arguments realized that those thousands of tweets were made by a bunch of people. So is this flow of information able to make the opinion? Probably yes, but consider the influence of TV even in parties that pretend to be based on the direct democracy. Okay, this is on the communication part, which I don't like too much. To me, it is important from a theoretical point of view, that is important for democracy, which is much important than Twitter or Facebook, is the impact on the debate that populist parties are reframing the concept of not people. The people does not exist. What people is. The people does not exist. The people exist if you frame it in the concept of a nation. So that is important, because every political leader can frame and reframe what they refer to as a people. And it is interesting the case of make great America again, whatever. But was something that was in the history of the US. The nationalism is not something new. I mean, does Barack Obama, which I love, 100%, was very international or was very nationalist in the international politics, or in the foreign politics, for example? So the role of nation and the role of framing what people means for each leader. In the case of the Northern League, which I had the opportunity to study. I'm tired of, but I studied it because people think that I'm from the Northern League. The people meant different things. Meant Milan, then meant North regions. Now in 2013 was Italians first. Italians first, like in a competition. Italians first and then migrants after. So this is for me, Hans, to answer seriously to your question, is the idea of stretching the concept of people to adapt. Because Macron is French people too. So this is very intriguing and can be dangerous for democracy. The fact that you say that with the social networks, people are at the same, or they feel they are at the same level, which is the odds of democracy. Because if you touch the leader, then the leader die. So you cannot touch the leadership. You should. I mean, this is not Passarelli. Is Max Weber. You should not touch the institutions. Otherwise, democracy failed. It's something like a club, but it's something else.
Can I add to that? Just I like what you said there. So this. Speaking particularly in the American conceptualization of citizenship, and I think there's probably a lot of this going on in a lot of democracies, but particularly the American conception of what a citizen is very individualistic. It's just very much this idea that I make my own decisions independently. When I reach the age of 18, I will go out and choose the candidates and the parties that best represent me. I don't need newspapers. I don't need parties to tell me what's best. I don't need leaders telling me what's best. I can make these decisions on my own, and we assume everyone else is doing the same thing. And as I learned in graduate school from John Zoller, among many others, this does not remotely reflect what actually happens in the world. We are socialized by our parents. We learn things sometimes very subtly through our education system, through the media, through parties, sometimes just by all the lawn signs that we pass on the way to and from work or from TV advertising that we think we're above. We get messages and we internalize them. But we continue to consider ourselves as individuals. Facebook has been terrible for this, where we over a great deal of time, and I'm culpable. I have spent about 10 years developing this really beautiful Facebook account and lovely page, where I just have no, not really, but where I just have a news feed that of all these wonderful things that my friends and people I respect and trust have posted, and I assume that this is something I have built, as opposed to a company that has been building things and selling advertising onto my space and using my data to create more things that will flow in there. And in some ways it reinforces things I was already going to do, and in some ways it's leading me in various directions, whether they're commercial or political. But in many ways, even though we call it a social network, it feeds this idea of us as individualized, as making our own independent decisions, when in fact I think it's even more creating the disconnect between what we think is happening and what is actually happening.
Sure.
I have to make a confession. I also study political communication, so
Nobody's
apologies. Sorry.
You're going to say you had a Facebook page, but okay.
Well, but actually, I think that Facebook and also looking at political communication, populist political communication, is very telling for understanding the mechanism and the supporting mechanism and dynamics of populism. I think that, a lot of the messages of political leaders and parties now, they pass through Facebook, so we cannot ignore that. And really, I agree with you that TV is really, really important now, and also media are very important in spreading populism, because, populism with conflict, negativity, blaming attribution is something that fits perfectly media logic. So populists have great attention and visibility on media, so it makes sense that if you take your information from mainstream media, you can approach a lot of populism. But really, I think that we have to take seriously into account the idea of social media as an arena of interaction for populist actors, I think, but that's maybe.
Can I jump in on elite use of social media? So I'm actually primarily thinking here about Twitter, because I've spent way too much time thinking about Donald Trump's Twitter feed at this point. But I think that the point raised earlier about the role of TV and radio before social media in changing politics, or at least feeding into panics about changing politics, is really important. This is not a new thing. But each of these media developments has allowed for this kind of fake sense of a direct democracy to evolve. And to emerge. This is something the late Robert Dahl referred to as a pseudo-democratization of the presidency. And I think that it really feeds into, it really makes fertile ground for more populist appeals from the American president, because you can feel like you have a direct relationship with the leader, that they are speaking to you and you don't need any mediation, as Seth was saying. And I think that one of the reasons that Trump's Twitter feed has been so compelling is, on the one hand, it totally fits this, right? It's not making him any more responsive, I don't think. It's not improving the quality of American democracy in a lot of ways. But I'm going to contradict myself in a second. But what it is actually not curated. So unlike very scripted radio speeches that FDR gave, I will let the record show I was not the one who brought up FDR, but I'm not going to let it drop.
This time.
And same thing with TV, right, where you have this sense of intimacy with a presidential speech, but then it's a completely scripted event and everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. And I think social media, if you looked at the way Barack Obama tweeted, that was very curated, right? Clearly no one is curating Trump's tweets, or if they are, they're doing a bad job. So I think on the one hand, there's a lot of fallout from this, but on the other hand, this violation of the norm actually does allow us some unique insight into exactly what the president is thinking in ways that we normally wouldn't get, I've read the memos that circulate internally in the White House, and many presidents have said critical and terrible things behind closed doors that we wouldn't want to know about. But Trump says them on Twitter. So it actually, I think, does give us a little bit of a window into transparency and authenticity that does marginally improve the situation. So in that sense, I think the violation of the norms in terms of how he uses direct communication has a somewhat different effect than you might predict.
Sorry, I would confess that I will, as soon as possible, retweet all Hans' tweets. I'm a big fan of.
Oh, well, that's, yeah, so I'll get up to like 12, 13 followers that way, so I appreciate that. Well, I have lots of things I'd still like to ask this group, but we're running down low on time, so I want to have at least a little bit of time for the audience. So, anyone here? Yeah, sure.
Yes, well, I wanted first to agree with the first speaker. I think your name is Antonella, no?
Yes.
In fact, so much so that I think a better title for this would have been Anti-Party Sentiment and Therefore Populism. That is, what comes first is a collapse of existing, particularly, of course, the centripetal parties in the middle, and then you get populism. So I think there is a direct causal connection between failures of existing party systems. The question is why? And I'll give you two answers that I think are out there, so to speak. The one is, of course, a very old one, and the Italians have a name for it. That's this partitocrazia. That is, there are certain tendencies within all party systems and democracy that lead to increased oligarchy and self-referential behavior and corruption, of course, and all this business. So you can blame it on the politicians. The other, however, which I find much more convincing, is, and of course much more serious, is the problem is the system of representation as such. And here, I would point to changes in basic social structure. And the code word that I've been using for this is from Durkheim, anomie. And that Durkheim was right. He was wrong at the time he talked about it because he had this one, very good hypothesis. Times of rapid social and economic transformation cut off people from their traditional senses of identity and rules. But what he didn't recognize was that industrial capitalism built new forms of solidarity. Finance capitalism does exactly the opposite. So what's the real problem is not with politicians. It's impossible to be a politician to represent individuals, as you, I think, just mentioned. I immediately thought of Phil Converse's opinion leaders. Remember that? That was very important. And of course, party identification as the bedrock of liberal American anyway, but democracy. That's all. There's no party identification. And I don't know who are opinion leaders anymore. But it seems to me that that's, I'd just like your opinions on why did traditional party systems not stop doing their job? Less and less people became members. People became much more likely to vote for different parties in successive elections, and you could go on and on. Why?
All right.
So if we want, I think we need to sort of solve the life, the universe, and
All
everything
right.
with that question, but go for
I
it.
think we do.
If anyone has any reactions. There's a lot there.
I think in the U.S. case, it's the nationalization of the party system, and then sort of nationalization of the polity. That's been really challenging to map onto the previous structures of how parties worked and how representation worked. And I think that's sort of where we're at in the U.S. case. I have no idea how that translates into other contexts, but that's my short answer to why is nationalization has not been particularly successful.
Of course, I would be crazy if I would say that I have the answer. But I think, this is a comment, not an answer. That is something that Seth was saying for the American case, the rise of the individualism. So the idea, right or wrong, the perception, the self-perception of being able to deal with the changes as an individual, alone. Not need of a political party, no need of a community. Bowling alone.
That is a little bit what Johan meant by anomie. Almost the definition of it.
Except for the, I hope not for the outcomes of Durkheim after anomie. But anyway, the idea of being able to manage your lives without an organization, which basically was in the 20th century was the political party. We thought we have been thought that the democracy is based on political parties, and I would say that still is. Parties have changed, but still are the core of democracy of the institutions. So, is on the citizen side that something has changed too. So, is the idea because of a high level of education, a better standard of lives, and so forth and so on. People think that once a kind of post-materialist attitude. So it's like critical citizens. I'm so aware of what the problems are that I dislike this group of parties. I cannot vote for them, but I really like democracy. As Paul Webb, with Paul Webb we were debating this morning. I don't vote. I don't like democracy because the only democracy is on my group, on the Green Party, Direct Democratia or whatever. So I think that one possibility can be the growing individualism that weaken the social organizations.
One of the things with respect to just the very last point that was made there, there's a sort of paradox in a way, because if we are heading towards this increasingly individualized, atomized kind of existence, it may be that seems to be apparent in terms of people being less and less willing to engage with political parties. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to be very evident in terms of people's willingness to engage with other forms of group life and associational life. So in a sense, I mean, the bowling alone thesis, which was fascinating, and I think there was lots of stuff in that was really telling. An awful lot of analysis suggests that it doesn't really work in many countries for many other forms of, associational life. So, and there's plenty of evidence that actually, particularly at the higher end of the socioeconomic scale, people are more and more willing to be joiners and participants in civic life. So, I mean, you're left with a kind of paradox there, which is kind of why not parties, why other forms of associational life. And the other point I would make really is a kind of reiteration of things which have been touched on anyway in the presentation. If you come back to the basic point about what is populism, there are many ideas that have been put forward. It doesn't seem to me that there's any specific type of policy content which fits populism. But if my Sussex colleague Paul Taggart were here, and he's written a lot about the subject, he would probably say at the core of it lies a hatred of representative politics, which I think you've touched on, and actually why it's so good for social media. And Antonella in particular pointed it out in some of your comments. The thing about social media is it's the promise of the direct relationship between the leader and the people, the virtuous people who are being betrayed by other kind of interlocutors whom you just don't need. And that's a separate point really from the other point, but you are two diverse and disconnected points possibly. But anyway, thank you.
Any reactions?
Yeah, just a short reaction, because I'm not an expert of populism, but it is true that there is an increase in terms of associational life organizations, but I think there is, at least for the Italian case, a difference in terms of education level of people being engaged on those organizations, and the type of organization. You say, why not parties? Because the party had or should have a general view, socialism, the future, the organization, green organization or whatever, Save the Children, is a narrowed answer, is going in the direction of individualism, of stressing my own identity. It's like on Twitter, you can block somebody, and you confirm your ideas. So if I don't like the X party, but I do work with the association that take care of women, of children, or dogs, or whatever. So, but I don't like the general idea of, because general idea, whatever it is, left or right, means to be part of a community. On that part, I'm part of a community, but is a narrowed community, that is a community that emphasizes my identity, on which I confirm myself, I confirm my views, so is a strengthening effect. But the question is still there. Why not parties?
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, I think, like, if we think of, at least in the United States, one of the in some ways, like, the golden age of associational political parties is mid 20th century, 1950s and 60s. People were joining clubs and they were volunteering, and they just, they couldn't wait to participate in these things. And parties stood for nothing at that time, or at least they didn't stand for anything that the other party didn't also stand for. In many ways, the ways people are forming associations today, sometimes in an online community, sometimes they can form, just have reinforcing patterns and relationships across state lines, across a whole country. In some ways, that's perfect for parties. And now that the parties actually stand for something, you could form alliances with people all over the place, and this would be a great time to do it. Except the moment you tell them that this stands for a political party, they're like, oh, I don't want any part of that. That's elite. I don't need that. I make my own decisions now.
I mean, I think to go back to what I said at the very beginning, I think some of it is that when there's an intra-party split, populism is a convenient kind of appeal, then it stokes this sense that parties are organizations that are illegitimately exercising power over you as a voter. And this is so. Back in December, Seth and I wrote a piece in the New York Times about party democracy, and we had a lot of people who were very generous with their feedback on Twitter about that. And one of the comments that I kept seeing, because I kept getting dragged into these discussions, was that we had said, or specifically that I had said, which whatever, that I should have more of a say in how the Democratic Party, which I'm not a member of, goes, more than they did. And that really was actually, it was not the funnest day on Twitter, but it was actually very informative about how people think about party democracy, which is like, this person, who's a word I probably can't say since we're recording, has said that she's more important than me and should have power over me. And I think that's been a very effective messaging strategy of populist intra-party movements, is that someone is illegitimately exercising power over you. And I also think that there are racial and to some degree gender dynamics in those messages in the US case that are present in both parties. And that has created a different stream than the associational life that we're talking about.
Well, I was thinking, a lot of suggestions and insights about this mutual estrangement between, the society and political parties. So I agree basically with all of you, and in particular also with Professor Passarelli, which underlined which stressed the relevance of post-materialist values and issues. I think this is related, as you said, to individualism. When you had to defend your right for work and, materialist values, you were a collective body and you need a collective actor. Then, when rights and values became individual, well, parties are not so relevant. Maybe they miss the point to defend your rights, and you find other and alternative strategies to raise your voice and asking to having a say. And I don't know, I think that I don't have the answer, sorry. But really, it's very stimulating, and I hope that you have the record of this conversation, because we need it.
Other questions? Jen here in the front.
So I've been sitting here thinking a lot about Aiken and Bartel's book, Democracy for Realists, that builds on a lot of John Zoller's work as well. And I'm wondering, to what extent does it seem like populism is sort of demanding of elections a function that they fundamentally can't perform, right? So the Aiken and Bartel's thesis is that elections are a failure of a mechanism to provide representation. And to some extent, what populism is seeking is democracy without parties. We're using parties to solve these collective action problems, but the populists want democracy without parties, and to some extent that's then demanding that elections are to perform a function that the research suggests elections cannot fundamentally do. I don't know, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. I'm interested to hear you talk about that. Part of the answer in my head has to do with this other part of the conversation, having to do with networks and the role of social media and so forth, which also seems like that is about this sort of false sense of agency that we all want to have. I have the sense that this is more of a problem in the American context than in other countries, and I don't know if that's true, but the whole sort of fantasy that Americans, not fantasy, but the American Revolution was all about this individualism, and we're gonna go off and, become our own thing and fight the elites, and now we're the individuals. And somehow that still seems very inbred in the American character. And the idea that we are these individual agents that are making our own choices, that is not just false in the social media sense that we've been talking about, but it's also false in the democratic sense, right? We've known since the time of Condorcet and then Arrow that democracy is not just aggregating individual preferences. Like, that actually doesn't exist. And so, I don't know. So I don't know where this is going as a question, but I want to know your thoughts about how, is it the case that populists are in fact demanding something of electoral institutions that they can't do, that the institutions can't do, and that part of the reason we have that fantasy is our interest in the false sense of agency?
All right. I think that kind of gets to the why now question. I'm not sure that U.S. institutions are, there's evidence that they're unresponsive in particular ways, right? And I think I keep going back to inequality as one example of that. And of course, there's evidence that they've become less responsive. We don't have good data from 100 years ago, so I don't know that we can necessarily speak to that. But that's, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I've now been up for like 40 hours, so so I'm going to pass to someone else.
Thinking about all the stuff you've been talking about, and I want to just throw another idea out there. I think that the problem that populism is trying to face is that parties are working too well. Parties organize the conflict, as I was saying earlier, and one of the things that has been organized out of the conflict is pro-immigrant feeling. In the United States, I don't know too much about Europe, but in the United States, there's a lot of anti-immigrant feeling. The Democratic Party wasn't representing it because it's a coalition of the kind of people that it is. The Republican Party, the leaders of that have been business who like immigration. Immigration feeds their factories. But a lot of their voters are being left behind or feel, well, they are being left behind, and they feel like the immigrants are responsible for that. And there was no way to get representation for that view within that political system that we have in the United States. It was like Southern racism had also been organized out of politics in the 1940s and 50s, which led to what the populist Wallace as a way of trying to break through the party monopoly on the organization of conflict. I feel like that the populists are people who feel that they're being left behind, that immigrants are one way that they can't get representation on that, but other ways. There's a whole bunch of things that you're not allowed to say because they're un-PC. Those people would like to say it. At least in the United States, Trump was the one who was willing to say it. He was anti-elite in that he would be un-PC. He would, Mexicans are rapists. Barack Obama is born in Kenya. These are impolite things to say. He would say them. A lot of people saw that as that represented their views that had been organized out of politics. I am not complaining about that, but I'm just observing that those people have a complaint. I think they are being left behind. Their children are having opiate crises. They're undereducated. Read Kathy Kramer's book. They feel left behind. They are being left behind. In the United States, I've done a lot of interviewing recently in the South, Western Arkansas, East Texas. Those people are being left behind. And they're protesting. And they've been able, in the United States, because we have a weak party system, to nominate Trump and get him elected. I think that the story in Western Europe might be that they would form a party there. You can't form a new party in the United States, so they're able to form parties that will be populist parties. But it's a protest against being left behind in a time of change. That's my perspective on it.
Can I? Yeah. So I think that's a very good observation. I think there's John Sides and Lynn Vavreck have a paper. I think it came out in print form recently, looking at the attitudes of primary voters and party leaders over the last few electoral cycles. And you see that, and as John points out, parties have been effective in steering particularly presidential nominations toward the kind of candidates they liked, who represent a particular worldview, and they've been organizing their kind of things. There's been a growing disconnect on the Republican side specifically between what the average Republican voter wants and what their average presidential nominee wants. The typical Republican voter did not get what they wanted from Mitt Romney. They didn't get what they wanted really from John McCain. And this has been just a gap growing over time, and whereas you don't see the same kind of gap on the Democratic side. And that, I think, sort of helps to answer the why now question, at least in the US case, is that there was this tension building up. And you can only constrain people's choices so far before there's a pushback, and that pushback might manifest in something that we're calling populism, for lack of a better word.
I think it's also worth pointing out that this is the first time in American history where anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-black racism have been organized on the same axis, right? So the Republicans were traditionally the party that was more skeptical about immigrants, but more open up until the 1960s on extending rights for African Americans. The Democrats were the opposite. There were moments where both parties were anti-immigration. And this is the first time that this sort of diversity axis, or whatever you want to call it, is really sorted. And I think that's really critical. But I also think, I want to temper the argument about people being left behind. And I've read, Kathy Kramer's work and Arlie Hochschild and that whole canon. But I also think it's worth pointing out that many people of color in the United States have also been left behind, and very few of them voted for Donald Trump or for Bernie Sanders, right? Actually didn't flock to either of the anti-establishment candidates.
Just a quick reply on the anti-immigrants arguments from populism. I can speak for the Italian case, and there is a way to frame the anti-immigrants argument within the idea of they are threatening our values, culture, and so on. But really, what I noticed, that I worked on media, as I said, and social media, and I content analyzed a lot of articles and Facebook messages. And what I noticed is that actually the blaming of migrants for whatever is usually associated with other populist contents that are related mainly on anti-elite. So the idea of migrants are threatening us, yes, they are evil and they are real. bad. But the real issue to blame is the elite, the EU, which is responsible for the migrant crisis, or the political class, which is not protecting us. So I don't know about how really this kind of rhetoric is permeating, let's say, the society. We saw that actually the right-wing parties got a lot of success during these last elections. But, well, as I said, when you see which of these claims are able to get more success on, for example, social media, you see that is not the anti-migrant claim. The anti-migrant claim is marginal in terms of likability, or we are supporting this view. The anti-elite is the driving issue and the driving content of the success, at least in social media, of populism.
Sorry, Hans. I was not checking my mobile because I'm rude, but because an advertiser signaled me that The Economist, which is a reliable source, the editor's picks of this week, the headline is Facebook's epic fail. So it's perfectly timely with our discussion. But of course, I'm not so naive to not consider the influence of social networks. But I think that there is something more, some zeitgeist or something. Because in Italy, for example, the source is the Minister of the Interior, because that, of course, is governed by communists. Is saying that in the last 5 years, there has been a decrease of 20% to 0 of crimes. 20% less. But if you say that to the small business, to the blue collar, to the student, to the just fired people, there is a mismatch between the expectation of what the system should do for you and the reality. Even though there is this mismatch, people's perceptions should be considered by parties. Otherwise, wrong or right, they will support somebody who will offer an easy answer, like everybody will work, we will fix everything, and we will fight the establishment. So when parties miss this duty, this mission that is representing the needs of citizens, then there is a problem for the democratic structure.
I think we might have time for one more question.
So the title of the talk is Populism and Anti-Party Sentiment, but in some ways, is the greater threat populism and pro-party sentiment? And I suppose in some ways, I'm asking what we mean by anti-party sentiment here. So on the one hand, we've done a lot of talking about populists who want to opt out of the party system, or social media as a way to marginalize parties. But on the other hand, the very reason we're having this panel is because of the success of populism in the party system, right? It is because populists have either co-opted mainstream parties, like the Republican Party, or because of the growth of parties like the Swedish Democrats, right? The Front National. So when we are talking about anti-party sentiment, do we mean anti-party? Do we mean anti-party system? Do we mean anti-establishment? And is the threat anti-party sentiment, or actually that populists are pretty damn good at competing in party-structured elections?
Now's the part where we define populism. Right?
Oh.
Yeah, real fast, just real quickly.
Yeah. The only thing between you guys and dinner is us defining populism.
We got till 12, right?
I think that my answer to that would be I would have much less snappily called this panel something like populism and issues with the idea of legitimate opposition, which Hans wisely did not call this panel. But that for me, that's sort of the shorthand for party is the idea of party competition and kind of back and forth in a democratic context.
I would say that the anti-party sentiment, of course, relates to the citizens, to the people, let's say. And simply, I think that populism is not recognized, even if there is a populist party, as a party, because it has not those characteristics of organization, of being recognized as that kind of actor. So, I mean, the five-star movement, even if they have a non-statute or even if they refuse the label of party, they are still running in electoral competitions. They are discussing for having the government. So basically, I think they are a party. At least they fit all the issues, but they are not recognized as that. They do not represent themselves as a party. So maybe the title of the panel is simply looks into different direction on the citizen side, people side, and the parties or populist sides.
I'm not going to try and specifically define what populism is, but at least one thing that populism probably is a series of rhetorical styles that are used in some campaigns, whether left, right, or anything else. And they, just evidence suggests they're probably pretty effective rhetorical devices that for a group that is trying to take over a political party. This is some set of, a rhetorical toolbox that you can use, and at least some chunk of that party will find it interesting and find it engaging, whether or not it actually conveys some sort of ideological package along with it. So, I think we're seeing some success there.
Nothing? All right. Well, so as we're winding down, and since I'm the one who actually chose the title, I'll take the last minute to say what I was thinking, and because I think you're right that really this anti-party sentiment doesn't manifest itself as in the ending of parties, but in a co-opting or changing. But it's a big part of what many of these parties are about, and that's why literally, I don't know if I would have arrived at the much more useful title that Julia had, but this really was me just like, I wrote something down and then turned out never got revised. But what I was thinking about was this degree to which, the five-star movement it claims it's not a party when it's a party. And that, the Sanders and Trump elements are running in part against the party establishment to succeed. And a number of other more established party, the Lega is definitely a party with a history. Even they still are like, and we don't like the establishment of the partyocracy. We want to disrupt it in some way, and that seems to be. And on top of that, I went on a rant this morning about the America No Labels, which is basically sounds like they have a label. It's called No Labels, and then they throw out some other labels like centrist and reasonable people or whatever, and it's still just about labels, and they're defining themselves. It's just like this far from being a party, just accept it. But and so I think there is a tendency, right, that this anti-party sentiment is a tool for success that works, and maybe again a similar way to the way which populism could be a tool, which is why I think that they're related and should be in the same conversation.
Yeah, but I think are two different maybe dimensions
that
sometimes map.
Yes. Right, for sure. So they're the and instead of all, together. And could have again a lot of other topics which I think we've actually raised in a useful way. So I want to thank the panelists for doing that, and thank all of you for being a great audience and asking such interesting questions.